Imagine carrying a wound that never heals. Not a scar, not a memory. An open, bleeding wound that no surgeon can reach because it lives somewhere medicine doesn't have a name for. Imagine watching yourself become a monster, not because you chose it, but because the pain left you no other option. Every relationship you touched, destroyed. Every moment of happiness that dared to show itself, swallowed whole by something dark and bottomless, living behind your ribs. Now imagine you have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. You control an empire that makes grown men tremble at the sound of your name. You have tried doctors in 5 countries, medications that turned you into a ghost of yourself, specialists who looked at you like a machine they were embarrassed to admit they couldn't fix. And still, every single morning, you wake up feeling like something essential was removed from you while you slept, and no one will tell you what it was or where it went. That was Kang Min Joon's reality for 10 years, every single day. And tonight, sitting alone at the top of a 43-floor building, with all of Seoul glittering beneath him like a city that had no idea he existed, it was killing him. The Hanam-dong penthouse didn't look like a prison. That was the cruelest part. Floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass, art on the walls that cost more than most people's homes, a private elevator, a motorcade waiting in the underground garage, a kitchen stocked by a private chef who came 3 times a week, 43 floors of imported stone and tinted glass that the city's skyline had simply absorbed, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know better. But the men in the lobby weren't concierge staff, and the man sitting alone at the edge of his king-size bed, knuckles white against sheets that cost more than most people's monthly rent, was not a man at peace in his kingdom. He was a man being eaten alive from the inside. Behind him, the evening told its quiet, brutal story, an overturned glass, a lamp that had met the wall at significant velocity, 3 missed calls from his personal physician, a dinner that a private chef had spent 4 hours preparing, untouched and growing cold on a table that could seat 12. The emptiness was back, worse than last week, worse than last month, always worse. Kang Min Joon was 36 years old. He commanded an organization that stretched from Itaewon to Busan, fingers in construction, logistics, private security, and the kind of work that never appeared on financial statements. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 turf wars, and a government crackdown that had dismantled every other significant crime syndicate in the region. He had built something from nothing, twice, with his bare hands and a ruthlessness that had become the stuff of underworld legend. In Seoul's criminal empire, they called him the Iron Ghost, and the Iron Ghost of Itaewon could not feel anything. Not happiness, not satisfaction, not the cold pleasure of victory that used to come after a successful negotiation or a territory secured. Not peace, not rest, not even the basic animal comfort of being full after a meal or warm after sleep. Just absence. A yawning, cavernous absence that no amount of money or power or human company had ever been able to fill, no matter how desperately he reached for something to put inside it. 10 years of this hell. 10 years of doctors who categorized and medicated and theorized. A psychiatrist in Vienna who had called it treatment-resistant anhedonia and adjusted his dosage 4 times before Min Joon stopped answering his calls. A neurologist in Tokyo who had tried a protocol so aggressive it left him bedridden for 8 days and changed nothing. A specialist in Singapore who had run every scan available to modern medicine looked at the results and told him with genuine regret that everything appeared normal, which was, Min Joon had thought on the flight home, possibly the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to him. Everything appeared normal, while he burned alive from the inside every single day. "Director Park is waiting," said a quiet voice from the doorway. SEO Young Woo, 41 years old, compact and unhurried, the kind of man who had learned early that stillness was its own power. He had been Min Joon's deputy for 15 years and had survived every version of him. The young, hungry version, the dangerous version, the version currently pressing his palms against his eyes, trying to push the pressure back behind them. He was possibly the only person on Earth who had seen all of those versions and chosen, deliberately, to stay. "Tell him tomorrow," Min Joon said without turning. It's the Seoul situation. The wolves moved men into the buffer zone. Any other night that would have required an immediate visible response, An incursion into a buffer zone was a message, deliberate, calibrated, designed to test. Left unanswered, it would become an invitation. Move our people to the north end, make it visible, no confrontation. He paused, and tell my brother I'll call him back. Young Woo was quiet for a moment. Min Joon knew what was coming before it arrived. He says there's someone, a healer, a practitioner working a wellness program at Seoul Institute. A careful pause. He's been researching her for 6 months. He says she's different. Min Joon laughed. The sound had no warmth in it. They're always different. He said if you don't agree to see her, he's coming here himself and bringing his daughter. Despite everything, something almost human moved across Min Joon's face. His brother's daughter was 4 years old and had appointed herself Min Joon's moral conscience, arriving at the penthouse once a month with hand-drawn assessments of whether he was doing good. He had no defenses against her, and Min Seok knew it. He looked at the city through the glass, all of Seoul glittering back at him, enormous and indifferent. The same city he'd bled and fought for. The same city that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. One appointment, he said. His voice was flat, dead. One. Young Woo nodded and left quietly. He had learned to take what he could get. If you're new here, subscribe now and turn on notifications because once this story starts, you won't want to miss a single moment. Let's begin. 6,000 kilometers away, in the city of Onitsha, a woman was closing the last box in an apartment she had lived in for 3 years. Adaeze Okonkwo was 31. She had a stillness that people noticed immediately, the kind that doesn't come from the absence of difficulty, but from having moved through difficulty and come out the other side with something still intact. She trained at the University of Lagos, completed a residency in London, returned home because the clinic in Onitsha needed people who actually showed up. She spoke 4 languages. She had hands that patients trusted before she'd said a word. She also had something harder to name. Her grandmother had called it a sensitivity, the ability to perceive what a person truly needed before they could say it out loud. Not magic, not mysticism. Seemed just a particular attunement to human suffering that made her exceptional at her work, and at times, heavy to carry in ordinary life. She felt things. Deeply. All the way through. The position in Seoul had come through an international psychiatric wellness placement program. Seoul Wellness Institute, one of Korea's most prestigious facilities for high-net-worth clients. The salary was significant. The opportunity was significant. Her grandmother had died 2 years before. But the night Adaeze accepted the position, she dreamed of her, sitting across a fire the way she used to when Adaeze was small, looking at her with that measuring gaze that saw further than eyes had any right to. There is someone waiting for you, the dream grandmother said, broken in a way the world has given up trying to fix. You will know him the moment you see him. Because the broken ones always recognize the people sent to find them. Adaeze woke with the smell of wood smoke in her nose and a calm in her chest she couldn't explain. She finished packing. She booked her flight. Seoul Wellness Institute occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Gangnam. It didn't look like a hospital. It wasn't supposed to. The clients who came here needed the ambient fiction of normalcy. They needed to feel like this was a choice, not a treatment. Adaeze's first morning introduced her to Director Choi Soo-yeon, a polished woman in her late 50s who had built the institute from a small private clinic into one of Korea's most profitable wellness facilities. Her welcome was precisely calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine, careful enough to reveal nothing. Your credentials are remarkable, Director Choi said. The program committee was very enthusiastic. However, I need to be direct with you. She folded her hands on the desk. Your assignment begins with a specific client. He's been here 4 months. 3 of our practitioners have requested reassignment after working with him. Adaeze kept her expression steady. Why? He is... Director Choi searched for words. Intense. His condition is unclassified. He presents with severe treatment-resistant anhedonia, significant emotional dysregulation, and what our practitioners have described as an overwhelming presence. He is not dangerous to staff. He simply doesn't believe he can be helped. And when he decides that about someone, he makes his position known. What does he want? The question seemed to catch the director slightly off guard. He wants to feel something. Anything. He's described it as living with a frequency dial broken between stations. Constant noise, no signal. She stood. Follow me. In the corridor, a young Korean woman materialized beside Adaeze with the ease of someone who had been waiting. Ji-yeon, she said, smiling, the kind of smile that worked very hard to appear effortless. I've been here 4 years. I know everything about everyone on this floor. Her eyes cut sideways. Your client, Kang Min Joon. You know who he is? I read his file. Ji-yeon made a small sound that suggested the file was a very incomplete prologue. I've requested this assignment 17 times, been denied every single time. A pause that was carefully constructed to sound casual. Nobody will say why. Adaeze noted the number, noted the edge beneath the smile, filed it. When the suite was at the end of the hall, private elevator access, separate entrance for security staff. Director Choi knocked once and stepped back. Adaeze walked in alone. The room was large and arranged to feel like a living space rather than a treatment room. Real art on the walls. A reading chair by the floor-to-ceiling windows where a man sat with a book open in his lap, not reading it, staring at the city below with the expression of someone awaiting a verdict they already knew was bad. Kang Min Joon. Even seated, even in the plain gray clothes of someone not performing anything for anyone, the authority was immediate. The set of his shoulders. The economy of his stillness. He was sharper than his photographs. Leaner, more carved, like a decade of vigilance had worn away everything that wasn't essential. He looked like a man who had been at war for so long, he'd forgotten there was anything else. But what Adaeze felt the moment she crossed the threshold, what moved through her with the certainty of something she hadn't chosen, was grief. His grief. Rolling off him like heat off summer asphalt. The particular grief of someone who has been in pain so long, they've stopped registering it as remarkable. Mr. Kang, she said, I'm Adaeze Okonkwo. I'll be your wellness practitioner. He turned, and the room went very still, the way a room goes still just before something in it permanently changes. His eyes were sharp and dark and exhausted in equal measure. He looked at her the way you look at a stranger who has said something in the exact accent of your hometown, recognition without any reasonable explanation for it. He stood slowly, walked toward her with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who needed to understand what they were looking at. Adaeze stood her ground. Her pulse was elevated, and she noted that with clinical detachment, and then noted that the clinical detachment was working harder than usual. You're not Korean, he said. His voice was low, accustomed to being the last word in any room. I'm Nigerian, from Onitsha, trained in Lagos and London. She held his gaze. Your file says you prefer directness, so I'll be direct. I'm not going to pretend I can cure you, but I'm going to try to understand what's actually happening, which is different from what your previous practitioners tried. Does that work for you? A silence that stretched long enough to be its own answer. He was still watching her with that concentrated focus. Sit down, he said finally, and tell me what you think is actually happening. She stayed for 3 hours. No one had ever stayed 3 hours. Young Woo, waiting in the corridor, noted this with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a seed push through concrete. Inside, Min Joon talked in a way he hadn't talked in years. Not the clipped operational shorthand he used with his organization. Not the controlled, managed calm he performed for therapists who were visibly afraid of him. He talked the way a person talks when they're too exhausted to manage their own image anymore. He told her about the emptiness, not the polished medical version, but the raw center of it. Waking at 3 a.m. with his hands shaking for no reason he could name. Food losing all taste for weeks at a time. Standing at the top of an empire he'd built with his own hands and feeling nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, not even the cold pleasure that victory used to carry in the early years. Just the same fundamental absence, scaled larger. Adaeze listened in a way that was itself unusual. She didn't take notes. She didn't nod at calculated intervals. She simply listened, hands quiet in her lap, eyes steady, like someone who had all the time in the world and found this particular person's particular pain genuinely worth it. Somewhere in the second hour, without planning to, Min Joon reached forward and placed his hand over hers on the armrest between their chairs. He froze, pulled back immediately. I apologize. It's fine. She turned her hand palm up. If it helped? He looked at her open hand, the offer of it. Then he placed his hand in hers, and the noise, the constant grinding static that had lived behind his temples for 10 years, dropped by half. Just like that. Just the warmth of a hand against his, and the frequency dial found something close to a signal for the first time in a decade. His jaw worked, his eyes went bright, and he looked away rapidly, the way people do when they absolutely refuse to cry in front of a stranger. What did you do? His voice was rough. Nothing. I'm just here. That's not nothing. He stared at the wall. That is the most something anyone has done in a very long time. The weeks that followed changed Kang Min Joon in ways his organization noticed before he did. He arrived at meetings on time and stayed for their duration instead of leaving the moment he'd said what he needed to say. He listened when his deputy spoke. He ate meals. He slept, not perfectly, not without interruption, but in actual stretches that left him rested in a way he'd forgotten existed. The restlessness didn't disappear, but it quieted, from a roar to a murmur, something he could hear himself think above. Young Woo watched all of this with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to attach to anything before it was certain. But privately, quietly, he allowed himself a small and fragile hope. Adaeze's sessions were unlike anything Min Joon had experienced in 10 years of treatment. She approached his condition not as a problem to be solved, but as a story to be understood. Patient, thorough, mapping the history of his suffering with the attention of someone who found the truth of it genuinely important. She brought frameworks from her own tradition alongside clinical ones, not with apology or performance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had watched these approaches work on people that other methods had abandoned. What he couldn't explain, what lived outside the language of clinical assessment, was the effect of her presence itself, the way the volume dropped when she walked into a room, the way her voice, unhurried and certain, pressed the static down like a hand pressing water from cloth. It wasn't technique, it was something older, like a frequency his body recognized and had been searching for without knowing what it was called. He invented reasons to extend their time together, medical questions that required long and detailed answers, concerns about his treatment plan that necessitated extensive review. Once, elaborately, a sudden and comprehensive interest in the dietary components of his wellness protocol that somehow consumed 45 minutes. Adaeze noted each pretense with a warmth she kept carefully off her face. She maintained professional distance with the discipline of someone who understood precisely why it mattered, and the increasing effort of someone who also understood, with a clarity that arrived quietly and refused to leave, that she was failing at it in all the ways that counted. He was not what she had expected. None of the men who moved through life behind that kind of power and fear were ever what you expected up close. Beneath the reputation, the crime lord, the iron ghost, the man who had built something from violence and held it together through 2 decades of ruthlessness, there was simply a person. A person who had been alone for so long it had become his default setting. A person who was quietly, almost secretly funny. A person who actually read, not for performance, and had opinions about what he read that he'd never shared with anyone because there had never been anyone willing to hear them. The night he told her about his parents, she stayed 2 hours past her shift without either of them noticing the time. His father had been a small business owner in Itaewon, import goods, legitimate, careful. He had been killed when Min Joon was 19 over a debt he hadn't owed, a clerical error in someone else's ledger that a powerful man had decided to resolve permanently. His mother had retreated into herself afterward, a grief so total it consumed everything else, including her sons. She died 4 years later. Cardiac arrest is officially something else by any honest account. Min Seok had been 15. Min Joon had been 23 and had already built the early foundation, of what would become the Iron Ghost's empire, not from ambition exactly, but from the bone-deep understanding of someone who had watched what the world did to people without protection. You built all of it, Adaeze said carefully, because you were trying to make sure no one could ever do to Min Seok what they did to your father. The longest silence she had encountered with him. No one has ever said that to me before. Is it wrong? He looked at the window for a long time. No, he said quietly. No, it's exactly right. She placed her hand over his on the table. This time he didn't move at all. Just looked down at her hand covering his, like it was something he was memorizing. He asked her to dinner without pretense or strategy. No manufactured reason, no professional framing. Just, at the end of a session one afternoon, I'd like to take you to dinner, not as a patient and practitioner, as two people. And then, with an awkwardness so profoundly at odds with his reputation that it was almost painful to witness. If that's something you'd consider. She said she'd think about it. She said yes 3 days later. The restaurant he chose was in Mappo, not a Gangnam showcase, not a place designed to impress or be photographed. Small, warmly lit, run by a family who had been in the same location for 30 years. The kind of place people went to for the food rather than the atmosphere. On the table, quietly arranged, jollof rice, made by a Nigerian cook he had sourced through a restaurant in Itaewon, egusi soup, fried plantains still warm from the oil, suya from a vendor who had confirmed by text message that everything was prepared correctly. Adaeze sat down and looked at the table and could not speak for a moment. My brother helped me research it, Min Joon said. He looked almost nervous, which was the most startling thing she had witnessed in all their weeks together. The most feared crime lord in Seoul, nervous about whether he'd gotten the jollof rice right. If anything is wrong, nothing is wrong, she said. You got everything right? They talked for 3 hours before either of them noticed. He told her about Min Seok's daughter, 4.5, already convinced she ran the household, empirically not wrong about this, and the monthly moral assessments she delivered with the gravity of a senior executive. He told her about the early years, before the empire had weight, when he and Youngwoo had operated out of a single office with 2 phones and a second-hand copier, and the absolute certainty that failure was not an option because there was no one to catch them if they fell. She told him about Onicha, about her grandmother's clinic behind the family compound, and the patients who arrived from surrounding villages with conditions that had no clinical name and left better, about her father lifting her onto his shoulders as a child and showing her the full length of the market and saying, "Every single person here is carrying something. Your work is to help them carry it." About the disorientation of London, enormous and self-contained and utterly indifferent. About coming home. About the loneliness of a gift that requires complete presence. Because presence is the one thing you cannot share or distribute. You give it entirely to one person and it's gone from everywhere else. Min Joon listened with his entire attention, not the polite attention of someone managing a conversation. The real kind, that costs something. You understand, she said, and then why I'm telling you that? Because I do the same thing. He considered the table, gave everything to building it, nothing left over for anything else. He paused. Until recently. She met his eyes across the candlelight. This is complicated. Yes. I'm your practitioner. You could stop being my practitioner. That's not how this works. I've negotiated peace between organizations that had been trying to kill each other for 12 years. He held her gaze. I'm willing to work with complicated. The way he said it, not as bravado, but as simple, flat commitment, the certainty of someone who has decided, moved something in her chest she hadn't expected to feel moved. One step at a time, she said. He nodded. And for the first time since she'd known him, the tension in his face was simply absent. He looked younger, like a version of himself that existed before the decade of burning. Tell me more about Onicha, he said. And she did. She should have seen Ji-yeon sooner. In retrospect, the signs were present from day one. The over-familiarity with a patient she had never treated, the proprietary way she spoke about Min Joon's preferences and history, the thinness of her smile whenever Adaeze returned from a session with news of genuine progress. But Adaeze had been focused on her work, on the careful and increasingly undeniable thing growing between her and Min Joon, and she had not paid enough attention to the hunger in a person who was very skilled at concealing it. The moment she almost caught it, a Tuesday morning when she arrived early to review Min Joon's medication logs and found them already pulled from the system, sitting outside his room in a stack that should not have been there, accessible, unattended. She mentioned it to the duty nurse, who had no record of pulling them. She made a note and let the session push it aside. She should not have let it aside. Meanwhile, in the observation corridor, Ji-yeon watched through the one-way glass with hands that had gone cold and a jaw that ached from pressure she wasn't aware she was applying. 4 years at this institute. 4 years in the same building as Kang Min Joon. 17 formal requests for this assignment, each denied without explanation. She had studied his file until she could recite his medical history in sequence. She had arranged herself in common areas at the precise moments he moved through them. She had done everything right, everything that should have worked. He had never once looked at her the way he looked at this woman. "You seem troubled." Director Choi's voice came from behind her, measured, patient, careful in the way of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Ji-yeon didn't turn around. "He's never responded like that. To anyone." "No," Director Choi agreed. "He hasn't." She appeared beside her niece, looking through the same glass, with an expression that was harder to read. "What is it you want, Ji-yeon?" "Truly." Ji-yeon's reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. Something in it was hard and hungry, and not quite recognizable. "You know what I want?" Director Choi looked at Adaeze's retreating form through the glass for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, patient and cold and very old. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose I do." She said nothing else. She didn't need to. What neither Ji-yeon nor Director Choi had accounted for was Min Seok. Min Joon's younger brother operated in the opposite way from everything the Iron Ghost represented. Where Min Joon moved through the world through control and calculated force, Min Seok moved through relationship and trust. He knew everyone connected to his brother's life, tracked developments quietly from the outside, and had a particular gift for noticing the moment something changed. When Adaeze disappeared from the institute on a Thursday morning, license suspended pending investigation, strongly advised to leave the country through channels that never officially advised anything, Min Seok noticed by Friday. By Saturday, he was on the phone with his brother. Min Joon didn't take the call. He was in the middle of the worst episode he'd had in years. The noise was back, all of it, all at once, crashing back like a wall of water through a broken dam. Every sound in the city scraped against him. The light felt hostile. His hands shook with a persistence that no amount of controlled breathing could address. Director Choi had come to him personally, with documentation, with Adaeze's treatment records, altered precisely and convincingly, showing a pattern of pharmaceutical manipulation. Compounds introduced gradually into his treatment that created a manufactured dependency, a biochemically engineered attachment designed to make him believe he needed her. Clinical notes bearing Adaeze's signature, discussing his assets, his isolation, his psychological vulnerability as a high-value target, and testimony from Ji-yeon, tearful, apparently reluctant, describing conversations she claimed to have overheard. Conversations in which Adaeze had spoken about him not as a patient, but as a means to an end. Min Joon looked at the evidence with everything he was, with every scar that a decade of building and surviving had left on him, with every person who had come close and used that closeness as a mechanism of extraction, with every lesson the world had delivered, repeatedly and without mercy, about what it meant to trust someone completely. And he believed it. Not because the evidence was flawless, because believing it was survivable, because if he believed it, he had lost a practitioner who had manipulated him, and he could absorb that. He had absorbed worse. But if he didn't believe it, if he looked at those documents and chose her instead, and he was wrong, and she had done what they said she had done, he could not survive that. Some part of him knew with absolute certainty that he could not survive that particular destruction, So he chose the version of events that protected what was left of him. She came to see him before she was escorted from the building. He would not let her speak long enough to say anything real. He told her to leave Seoul in a voice he reserved for people who no longer had his protection, flat, final, containing nothing human. He watched her try to reach him, and he built a wall behind his eyes and held it there. She left. The noise returned full volume, permanent and crushing, and he stood at the window of his penthouse and looked at the city he had built an empire to control, and felt for the first time in his life that he deserved exactly this. Every empty, screaming second of it. Adaeze landed in Lagos with 2 suitcases and a professional reputation that had been efficiently and thoroughly destroyed. The license suspension was real. The clinical board inquiry was real. The communications circulating through Seoul's medical community, framing her as a practitioner who had deliberately cultivated a parasocial dependency with a vulnerable, wealthy client for financial gain, were real in their consequences, even though every single word of them was fabricated. She called her father the first night. She didn't tell him everything. She told him enough. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "I raised you to know the difference between failing and having something done to you. Do you know which this is?" She knew. So she worked. Her father gave her the back office of his clinic, a small room with a borrowed laptop and a window that looked onto a courtyard where someone had planted tomatoes that were coming in regardless of the season. She spread her materials across every available surface, and she worked 18-hour days, and she did not allow herself to stop, because stopping meant confronting the full weight of what had happened, and she was not ready to carry that yet. She had documented everything during her time at Seoul, not because she had anticipated this, she hadn't, not this, but because meticulous documentation was the habit of someone trained in environments where records were the only protection available to people without power. Every session note she had personally filed, every medication administration she had personally overseen, every access log, every communication, every timestamp she could recall or reconstruct. The forgeries were convincing. They were built on real knowledge of Min Joon's treatment, his documented sensitivities, the correct dosage ranges, the right clinical language. Whoever had constructed them had access to his actual records, but they hadn't been there for every moment, and incomplete information leaves edges. She found the first edge on a Wednesday. A medication notation in the forged records showed her administering a treatment at 11:30 a.m. on a specific date in April. On that same date, at that same time, she had been across the building conducting a mandatory intake assessment for a new client, logged in a separate system, witnessed by 3 staff members, including the intake coordinator whose signature appeared on the same document. 2 records, same time, 1 location. She stared at the discrepancy for a long time. Then she started pulling threads. Min Seok arrived at her father's clinic without announcement on a Thursday evening, his coat dark with rain, looking like a man who had taken 3 flights to reach a decision before he changed his mind. "He doesn't know I'm here," he said immediately before she could speak. "He doesn't know where you are. I've been looking for 3 weeks. Why?" Min Seok was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough in the way of someone saying something true that they have been holding for too long. "Because I have watched my brother for 36 years. I know what he looks like when he has found something real. I know what he looks like when he has destroyed it." He met her eyes. Right now, he looks the second way, but he also looks like he knows it, and Kang Min Joon does not know something and do nothing about it. Eventually. Adaeze studied him. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same jawline, the same intensity, but Min Seok carried his differently. Approachably. Like a person who had never needed to weaponize it. "Sit down," she said. "I'll show you what I found." The investigation took 5 weeks. Min Seok brought his lawyer and a forensic accountant who owed him a professional favor. Adaeze brought 5 weeks of meticulous reconstruction. Together they pulled threads until the full picture emerged. Director Choi Soo-yeon's employment history, examined across 3 previous institutions, revealed a pattern. Wealthy clients whose records had been selectively altered, practitioners removed under suspicious circumstances, confidentiality agreements that had buried complaints before they became public. She had been quietly pushed out of 3 facilities in 8 years. Seo Han had been the fourth opportunity. The financial record arrived on a Tuesday night and sat on Adaeze's desk like a verdict. A payment, while significant, routed through a subsidiary company to a private account linked to Director Choi. The source, a business entity registered to Lim Dae-suk, who operated a consortium of construction and logistics companies in Incheon. The same Lim Dae-suk whose territorial ambitions had been in direct and escalating conflict with the Iron Ghost's organization for 4 years. For the same Lim Dae-suk who stood to gain considerably from the Iron Ghost being destabilized, mentally compromised, isolated, stripped of the person who had been making him stronger and clearer and more dangerous than he had been in years. Ji Yeon had not known about Lim Dae-suk. She had been used. Her jealousy had been a tool, identified and deployed by someone with a much larger objective. That did not absolve her. She had provided access to Min Joon's records. She had given false testimony, but she had not understood what she was part of. Director Choi had understood perfectly. This wasn't about me, Adaeze said, staring at the financial record in the quiet of the back office, with her father's tomato plants visible through the window. It was never about me. No, Min Seok said. You were how they reached him. The one place he was open. His jaw was tight. Someone identified that and paid to have it destroyed. Adaeze was quiet for a long moment. We need to present this where it can't be buried, she said. Min Seok was already reaching for his phone. I know exactly where. Min Joon's monthly organizational meeting took place on the first Tuesday of every month in a private room of a restaurant in Gangnam that had been under Iron Ghost protection for 12 years. Every senior member of his organization attended. It was, by established custom, the one setting where certain categories of information could be surfaced and addressed with collective witness, because collective witness created accountability that no single voice could quietly overturn. Min Seok had grown up watching his brother run these meetings from a distance. He had never attended one. He walked into this one 6 minutes after it started, soaking wet from the rain outside, and placed a tablet on the table directly in front of Kang Min Joon without a word. The room went absolutely still. On the tablet, the financial record connecting Lim Dae-suk to Director Choi. The forged documentation with timestamp annotations showing the specific contradictions. The sessions that couldn't have happened when Adaeze was documented elsewhere, by separate systems, with multiple witnesses. Director Choi's employment history across 4 institutions. Ji Yeon's communications with her aunt, including the date she had provided access to Min Joon's treatment records. And at the end, a single document. Adaeze's own reconstruction, methodical and precise, but of every discrepancy she had found from a back office in Lagos over 5 weeks. Min Joon read it. He read it with the full attention of a man who had built an empire on the ability to identify manipulation, to see the architecture of a deception and understand exactly how it had been constructed and by whom and for what purpose. As he read, the room held itself very still around him. He looked up. His eyes found Director Choi, who had been invited to the meeting under a pretext Min Seok had arranged 2 days prior. She was seated near the wall, and the color had left her face completely. You were paid? Min Joon said. His voice was quiet in the particular way that was much more frightening than volume. By my enemies, to enter my treatment, access my records, construct a fraud that would make me unstable, isolated, and compromised at the moment I was becoming the strongest I had been in years. Director Choi said nothing. There was nothing to say that the room would believe. That is not a medical ethics violation. Min Joon set the tablet down. That is a coordinated attack on this organization, financed by Lim Dae-suk. He looked around the room at his assembled captains, men who understood without requiring explanation exactly what they were witnessing. Everyone in this room understands what that means. He stood. He looked at Young Woo. Handle it, he said. All of it. Young Woo nodded once. Min Joon turned to his brother. Where is she? Lagos, her father's clinic. He was already moving toward the door. He landed in Lagos on a Saturday morning, having prepared nothing. He had decided, somewhere over the Indian Ocean, That preparation was the wrong approach. Prepared words were the words that sounded right rather than the words that were true, and he had caused enough damage with words that sounded right. He arrived with nothing but what he actually meant to say, which felt more terrifying and more honest than anything he had done in years. He found the clinic in a part of the city that moved at a different frequency from the approach he'd taken from the airport. Denser, louder, more alive in the way that cities are when they haven't been insulated from themselves by money. The clinic was a converted building behind a compound wall. Children sat on the front steps. A man was repainting the gate with the focus of someone who took the work seriously. Min Joon stood on the street for 2 full minutes before he went inside. They told him she was in the back. He walked through a waiting room, through a corridor, and found her in a consultation room with a window looking onto a small courtyard garden where something was flowering despite the season. She was reviewing patient notes with the focused attention she brought to everything she touched. She turned when she heard him. Her expression moved through several things in rapid succession: recognition, something briefly and involuntarily warm, then a deliberate and careful retreat into stillness. They looked at each other across the room. "You saw the documents," she said. "Not a question." "My brother showed me." "Then you know I was framed?" "Yes." A silence that had weight and shape. "You believed it." Her voice was even, not accusatory, simply accurate. "After everything, after every session, at every conversation, you looked at fabricated documents and you chose the version of me that confirmed what you already believed about the world." "Yes." He came into the room and stopped well away from her, left distance that was its own admission. "I've spent 5 weeks looking for an explanation for what I did that would make it understandable. I haven't found one." She turned fully to face him. Her eyes were dry. She was somewhere past that now, somewhere quieter and more difficult to reach. "I lost my license. My career reputation was sent through the entire Seoul medical community. I had to leave a position I had earned through years of work." She said each thing clearly because they were true and needed to be said. "And you did that? Not Director Choi, not Ji Yeon. You. Because when the moment came, the one moment it mattered, you chose fear over everything we had built." He said nothing. There was nothing defensible. "I saw you," she continued, and something moved beneath the steadiness of her voice. "From the very first session. Not the Iron Ghost, not the crime lord. A person in extraordinary pain who had convinced himself it was permanent. I stayed every time. I gave you every reason to trust me and not one reason to doubt me." "No," he said quietly. "You didn't." "Then why?" "Because." He sat down in the chair nearest the door, pressed his hands flat on his knees. He spoke slowly, finding the words as they arrived rather than delivering ones he had prepared. "Being wrong about you was something I could survive. Being right about you and losing you anyway, believing you were real and letting it be destroyed, I wasn't strong enough for that, so I made you the problem instead. I chose the version of events that let me keep breathing." Silence. In the courtyard, something moved in the wind. "That was a choice," she said. "Yes." "Not a symptom, not a trauma response you couldn't control. A choice." "Yes." "Then I need you to understand that before anything else." She held his gaze. "Because I will not be someone that a person settles for when the easier thing to believe is gone." "I understand." He met her eyes fully. "I'm not here because the easier thing is gone. I'm here because what I did to you was wrong, and you deserve to hear me say that directly. And because," his voice roughed slightly, "because the noise is back. All of it. Constant. Yeah, and I'm not telling you that to leverage you. I'm telling you because you asked me once to be honest with you, and I'm trying to be that now, even when it doesn't serve me." Adaeze was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Saturday. Children's voices from the front steps, the sound of the gate being repainted. Her father's voice somewhere deeper in the clinic, calm and certain, talking to a patient who needed exactly that. "Go home," she said finally. Her voice had shifted, still guarded, but the door had not locked. "Fix what needs to be fixed. And when you've done that, She paused long enough that he understood this pause cost her something. Then we'll talk about what comes next. If anything does. He stood. He wanted to say more. He understood that more was not his to take. At the door, he stopped without turning around. Your license will be reinstated. Your reputation will be corrected at every institution that received those communications, every facility, every board, every colleague. Whether you come back to Seoul or not, whether there is anything between us or not. A pause. You are owed that. That part is not contingent on anything. He left, and Adaeze stood in the consultation room with her hands at her sides and looked at the garden through the window, at the flowers coming through despite the season, and let herself feel, for the first time in weeks, the full, complicated weight of a grief that was also, underneath everything, still love. He spent the next 4 months doing what he had promised. He handled Lim Dae-suk through the channels available to the Iron Ghost of Itaewon, which were thorough and final and require no further elaboration. Director Choi faced both legal proceedings and a professional investigation that Min Seok's lawyer and Youngwoo's network ensured were public and complete. Ji Yeon's certifications were reviewed and her career in high-end wellness came to its conclusion, the most proportionate consequence available and the only one Min Joon pursued on that front, because she had been used, and using her further felt like the wrong kind of justice. He contacted the Korean Medical Board himself, not through intermediaries, himself, in person, sitting across from the review committee with the full documentation of what had been done, making it unambiguous that Adaeze Okonkwo had been the target of a coordinated and deliberate fraud, and that the speed with which the board had accepted that fraud without verification was something they would want to address. He was not comfortable in that room. He went every time he was asked. He found a therapist in a small office near Hongdae, someone who did not appear to know or care about his reputation, who looked at him on the first session and said simply, "You've built very effective systems to prevent yourself from being hurt. Let's talk about what those systems cost you." He went back every week. He did the work, the real work, the uncomfortable and humbling kind that has no audience and no visible result except the slow and incremental change of becoming, very gradually, someone capable of more than survival. Min Seok noticed. His daughter noticed in the way that 4-year-olds notice things. She arrived at the penthouse in the 4th month, assessed him solemnly over breakfast, and announced that he looked less like a scary statue. He asked if that was an improvement. She said, obviously. He put it in the category of meaningful progress and meant it. He sent no messages to Adaeze. He had made a promise in Lagos, and the promise was not contingent on contact. Proving something was different from claiming it. It was Min Seok's wife who eventually reached out, not on behalf of Min Joon, but simply as one person writing to another. She described what the months had looked like, what she had witnessed. She wrote without agenda, without pressure, without anything asked in return. Just the truth of what had happened, offered to someone who deserved to know. Adaeze read the letter 3 times over 3 days. Then she booked a flight. She texted from the airport with the particular honesty of someone who had decided to stop protecting themselves from the possibility of being hurt again. "I'm coming. Not because you asked. That part is important." He wrote back within 30 seconds. "I know. I understand. I'll be here." He met her at the Mappo restaurant. The same one, the same small back room, the same family who had been there 30 years, the same warmth that had nothing to do with expense. He was there before she arrived, and he stood when she came in, and he waited, which was the most important thing, the waiting, giving her the space to set the terms. "You look better," she said. "I am better." He stayed standing, still in progress. That's true of most people worth knowing. He sat across from her. The table between them felt different from the last time, still a distance but a navigable one. "I've been in therapy every week for 4 months, he said. "Not the facility kind. The kind where someone sits across from you and asks you things you don't want to answer, and you answer them anyway because you finally understood that the only way out of certain things is through." He held her gaze. "I'm not done. I don't think I come back from what I did in one clean movement, but I'm doing the work. I know, she said. Min Seok's wife wrote to me. He nodded, unsurprised. He had suspected his sister-in-law would find her own path to honesty. It was her particular gift. I'm staying in Seoul, Adaeze said. I've accepted a position at a different institute. That's not contingent on anything between us. I want to be clear about that. I understand. But... She placed her hands on the table. He looked at them, her hands, which had been the first thing to quiet the noise in him months ago, in a room where he'd walked toward her not understanding what she was or what she would mean to his life. The person I knew before everything happened, I believe he was real. I believe it wasn't a performance. It wasn't. Then I'd like to find out who he is now. She met his eyes evenly. Slowly, with the understanding that trust is rebuilt from the bottom, not from the top, and not all at once. Slowly, he agreed. I have a great deal to prove. You do. I intend to. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she put her hand across the table, palm up. The same gesture she had offered months ago in a treatment room, to a man who had been in pain for 10 years and didn't know what to do with the first thing that helped. He put his hand in hers. Outside, Seoul moved through its ordinary evening, enormous, indifferent, and completely unaware that inside a small restaurant in Mappo, the iron ghost of Itaewon was learning, slowly and with great effort, what it felt like to be at peace. Some wounds cannot be cured. They can only be understood and carried differently by someone who has chosen to stay. This was not a simple love story. It was not a story about a woman who fixed a broken man. It was a story about a man who had to be broken open before he could understand what he was missing, and a woman who was strong enough to let him find that out for himself, and then, after everything, still be standing there. That is the only kind of love that lasts. If this story moved you, you are exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and stay close, because we are just getting started, and the best stories are the ones that take their time.